What's up guys, and welcome back to Gabe Miller Music. Today I'm going to be showing you how to make an electro house drop. I'm going to talk about a bunch of kind of the big picture techniques, a bunch of very specific techniques, and some Novation Circuit specific tips for getting a modern EDM electro house drop with some groove and some bite to it. So you've already heard the drop I played in the intro, so I'm going to break this down and then talk about a couple of other musical passages as well. So let me quickly play a slightly extended version of that drop, and then we'll actually get into the layering, composition, and a bunch of super specific techniques that you can use. So let's start off with the layering itself. So let me mute all this stuff. So here is your main bass, lead. It's a bit of both, and I'll get to that in a second. The pack I'm using is the pack by Digifx out on Isotonic. I'll link it in the description. Not a sponsor, just friends of the channel. And I've been using it mostly for kind of chill, like retro style music, but it's actually been pretty good for slightly chunkier, more aggressive electronic music as well, which is cool. So that's the bass lead thing. Here's the bass that's actually providing most of the low end. And then here are the drums, kick, pretty straightforward, kick and clap. So reverse cymbal, clap combo. So real quick, let me get into more details on the drums because there are a couple of specific things that I went out of my way to do. First of all, this is a fairly short punchy kick, which is pretty par for the course for a lot of EDM. And with that is this clap, and it seems like it's hitting way too early, but I've got micro steps programmed in here. So this hits right before the kick hits, like milliseconds before the kick hits. Very common technique in a lot of EDM, especially more in the progressive and electro house genres. Kind of drives the beat forward, creating this little flam between the kick and the snare, or the kick and the clap in this case. And then we build on that with, I use sample flip to achieve this effect. In this case, this is just right on the kick, so even more of a flam going on between the two claps. And that creates some variation all on its own. And then finally, super simple, 909 open hi-hat. That's basically it for the drums. So let's move on to what really makes this drop electro house specifically, starting with how these synths kind of work together, because I mentioned earlier that this synth right here is kind of somewhere between a bass line and a lead line, and that's definitely intentional. There's not really a ton of low end to this specific patch. If you get it down way lower, there absolutely is. Which is awesome, and it's a completely different vibe. But in this case, if I'm trying to adhere to the kind of staples of modern EDM electro house, I took this up an octave, so the melody it's playing is very clear, and then this bass is what's holding down the low end, and it's doing this kind of octave jump pattern for most of it. Once you hear that pattern, that or some variation thereof, you are never going to be able to unhear it. It's everywhere in electro house. It's usually not used as like a main feature that jumps out at you. It's usually there kind of just providing low end, working well with the kick, and supporting everything else that's going on. But then for that little response part, this right here, this main line jumps up quite a bit and needed more low end support, and I don't want any bass notes really clashing. So it's providing the low end and it's providing the rhythm while this guy just kind of drones on. And then for the response, it actually doubles it. So let's talk about call and response, because that's the next thing that I think is really important for electro house and a lot of bass music in general that can be sometimes overlooked. There's a great Barely Alive video more on the dubstep context that I'll link to at the end of this video. And they basically put into words something that I'd already kind of been noticing, and they made me much more aware of call and response in an EDM context and kind of doing it on purpose rather than just imitating other stuff you've heard. So the way it manifests itself here, let me just mute everything else. You've got your call, this droning note, and I'll get into the pitch bend in a second, and then here's your response. And then call again. Response with some variation. And that right there creates a really nice contrast and a nice bit of consistency at the same time. Much like with the octave jump bass, once you hear this, you'll probably never be able to unhear it because it's that common and it's that effective, especially for music like this. I mentioned the pitch bend. This patch specifically has a good bit of glide embedded in it. And so I'm intentionally triggering that by holding down two notes at the same time at the very beginning. Let me show you that. So this one just triggers very briefly. This one keeps going. And because they trigger at the same time, the circuit goes, I don't know which one to play because this is a monophonic patch, so I'm just going to play them both in sequence. And this one is much shorter, so I'll play it first. So the end result of that is a really nice pitch bend that acts as a really good opening impact for the drop. Oftentimes, I also might use a horn sample for a similar intro to the drop impact that adds some punch to that first beat. And that adds a bit of attitude to the drop as well. And the whole droning note transitioning to kind of a short stabby melody also lets me create variation and make full use of the only two synth tracks. Since you can't necessarily switch between a ton of sounds super fast, you have to do it with kind of melodic tricks and just using the synth patches to their fullest potential instead, which you can absolutely do, and you can get some pretty powerful stuff out of it. And of course, I could take this even further if I wanted to do some kind of automation by holding down record and then twiddling some parameter. And also, for those of you curious, these are my sidechain settings. I typically don't go much higher than this. This is what it would sound like if I did. That's probably a bit much. I kind of dig it for what it is, but this seemed to be the range that I was going for. So from here, of course, I can go ahead and build it up. I could start with just kick and these two patches. Build it up by adding the clap. And then finally, ratchet the energy level up an entire notch with the hi-hat. And also, it's worth mentioning that if I wanted to do kind of an intro, I could strip out that main part. Even just reduce this to 1 bar long. Maybe tease the... That came in at the wrong timing, but hopefully you get the idea. And then I can start to build it up from there. Either I could transition to a breakdown melody, or I could introduce the main melody, but a much less powerful version, and go into a build. I did an entire video on how to do builds and drops on the circuit and how to build up energy despite not having access to like riser samples or anything like that. I'll link that at the end of this video as well. But let's move on to a bit of a different kind of electro house drop, because this is your modern EDM style. This is more your kind of Wolfgang Gartner style from a few years before Big Room really kind of took over. And this is kind of my attempt at emulating Complextro without any of the complexity, because once again, you can't necessarily switch between a bunch of crazy sounds all at once and still have it be sidechained and always in key. So I've emulated that by, once again, a lot of octave jumps. And in this case, I've actually just layered two bass patches doing the exact same thing. So there's this patch. This is providing a lot of the low end. And then this is providing a lot of the grit and the width. So I've got a bit of distortion up. This is kind of super saw patch together. They reinforce each other. And I'm getting this kind of timbral switch up by doing, once again, octave jumps. I talk about octave jumps a lot. I've also talked about doing it in like a trap context with 808s. It's a really common technique, and it's for good reason. It's really useful. So the drums are pretty similar to what I showed you on the first drop, with the key difference of the hi-hats and the snare. And the hi-hat is much closer to that of a real drum kit. In this case, I don't think I bothered with any velocity variation, but if I want to take that even further, I could do something like this. And also I did a bit of a variation on call and response here, because you've got your call with this initial little lick. And then your response. But then over here, you've got this little turnaround that completely switches everything up. And this last bar switches up the timbre characteristic. It's got that long drawn out note instead of these short staccato notes. And the melodic part itself really wants to resolve to that root note. So when it does, it's satisfying. So that's a nice turnaround. It gives your ears a break very quickly from these 3 bars that sound pretty similar, and makes it all the more satisfying when it comes back around. Finally, let's talk about some kind of breakdown. In this case, this is what I've got. You'll notice the octave jump again with the bass line. I can't help myself. In this case, this is a pretty common bass timbre to use. A lot of the times in breakdowns like this, especially lately, you're gonna hear either this kind of almost 80s inspired bass or a really kind of pulled back Reese style bass. This is somewhere in between. It's got a bit of movement to it. And once again, that's from the Digifx pack. Just doing these long sustained notes, except for that little turnaround at the end. And then this melody. I've got a good bit of ping pong delay and reverb on that. And then if I was to open the filter on that, you could almost use that for like a big room kind of melodic house drop, which I've done. But let me let you in on a little secret. A lot of the time, you can kind of take 2 separate melodies with a similar vibe and just mash them together and call that an EDM song. And you'd be surprised at how much people do this. And if the melodies are really in a similar vibe, they use a lot of the same melodic devices, they have very similar rhythm, you can just mash them together as long as you have a good clean buildup and it'll just work. So you've got this. It doesn't have the call and response thing going on. It has a bit more of a progression to it. But it still feels like it fits quite nicely. With this drop. And obviously they're in the same tempo, same key. Even though they're not the same, they've got similar enough vibes to work quite nicely together. Lastly, one extra thing I want to point out with this kind of drop version of that breakdown. A lot of big room progressive house relies heavily on a melody line and a gritty bass, and having a pad like filling out chords or some kind of supersaw chords is almost optional. I used to think that to get a big EDM drop, you need these giant supersaw chords, and sometimes that can work, but usually you're better served by having a really gritty bass supporting a really kind of soaring lead. And I could drop that, and that already sounds decently full despite being pretty minimally layered. Anyway, that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to learn about how to make buildups to connect your breakdowns and your drops, you can click or tap up over here somewhere. And if you'd like to learn more about call and response in an EDM context, you can click or tap down over here. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.